Recently we looked at what I refer to as the blacksmith's challenge. Just a name given to a specific personal challenge that I use to spur my creativity and think that it might be a good idea for you to challenge your imagination and develop some creativity. And the challenge, simply put, was 1/2 inch square bar, 3 inches long. Doesn't matter if it's mild steel, wrought iron, tool steel. Just depends on what you want to make out of it. And you can make anything you want out of it. That's the challenge, is think about what the mass is and how you can change that mass into what you want it to be, not just make something that looks like a 1/2 inch square bar. And I mentioned that I had made some little railroad spikes. And out of one of those railroad spikes, little mini railroad spikes, I made this little mini railroad spike knife. And there's videos showing both of these things. But I have a third spike that hasn't had anything done. And I'm going to make a little railroad spike tomahawk out of this. Not that I need a railroad spike tomahawk, I thought it would just be fun, and blacksmiths seem to really like railroad spikes and they like tomahawks, so that's what we're going to do. To do this, we're going to need to create an eye, and we're going to need to be able to drift the eye. So let's carry the challenge a little bit further. I have 2 pieces of 1/2 by 1/2 by 3 inch long that used to be coil spring. I squared it up till it was about 1/2 by 1/2. This is a hair oversized, so I'm actually going to get a little bonus material out of this. Maybe that's cheating, but I don't think it's enough oversized that it's going to make much difference. But that's just what size it ended up, so that's what we're going to use. It's still under 5/8, but a little bit over 1/2. But they are 3 inches long, so I'm going to make a drift out of one. I'm going to make an eye punch out of the other one. Probably start with the eye punch and then make the drift. And we're going to see what we end up with. And then, in a future video, we will make a little tiny railroad spike tomahawk. I've got one of my pieces in the fire getting hot. This will be the punch. I'm going to make sort of the Brian Brazil style that is somewhere between a slitting chisel and a punch. It's not flat bottom, it's kind of pyramid shaped. And I'll show you the exact shape of that when we get to that point. I'm going to try and draw this out a little bit, make it a little bit longer so it's easier to work with. Now the truth is that there is no way I'm going to hand hold this punch that close to the hot material without burning myself, even with the hot mill gloves on. So these will end up being punches that are held in a pair of tongs, and that makes a nice little handled punch. Maybe at some point we will use these tools to make some handled punches out of the same material, just because we could. I think in that case it's okay to make the handles out of wood. The tool is what you're really making is the challenge, so if you make a wooden handle, I think you're okay. So I'm going to start just by drawing this down to a little smaller square. I'm going to taper the struck end just a little bit more and give it just a little bit of an octagon. And some of this is just to make it a little bit longer tool. And some of it's just because I like the looks of it better. So that's really all I'm going to do to the struck end of the tool. I'm going to turn it around and we're going to start working on the actual punch end. I'm going to leave this fairly heavy in the middle. I'm going to draw out a taper for the actual punched end. This is going to be a fairly small punch because it's a fairly small little tomahawk. And that is all of the forge work that I'm going to do to this at this point. Kind of round that up just a little bit there. So you can see the shape. Got a nice taper to the struck end, so it'll kind of center the blows and it won't mushroom so easily. But it's still left as fat as I really can in the middle. And then it tapers down to what will be the punch end. And that is presently 5/8 by 1/4. And I think that'll be a reasonable punch size. We're going to round up the corners a little bit. I guess I'll try to do some of that at the forge or at the anvil here. But then we'll have to grind or file the point in the way we want it. I'm just rounding that up so I have a round slot when I punch the eye in the axe. But it mushrooms over a little bit, so we got to flatten it back out. Pick it up off the floor. And no heavy forging blows at this low heat. These are just kind of cleaning up blows, planishing blows. Okay, that's where I'm going to leave that. I'm going to bring it back up to heat and put it in the vermiculite to let it slow cool. Now we're going to start another piece the same size to make a drift out of. Now this I'm going to want to make a long tapered kind of teardrop oval, kind of a typical tomahawk shaped drift I think is what I want for this. And we'll see just how well we can do with such a short piece. Now it occurs to me I may actually want this to be ever so slightly fatter than it is. So I'm going to upset the fat end of this drift. And that should be plenty of upset. Put a little taper on the top end of it and leave this area right through here as the fat spot. Now we'll start flattening that out. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flatten it corner to corner so that I end up with a sharp ridge at the front for the teardrop eye. And then we're going to have to round up the back. I'm going to work from both sides to try and keep it as even as I can. And that's all I'm going to do on this end because I want to leave it as fat as I can. I just wanted to get some of that done while I had that end hot. So now we'll go to this end. And this is going to still have to taper out. So I'm going to draw it out square to start with, and then we'll start flattening it and working on the oval or the teardrop shape. So keeping it square, the same theory as drawing most tapers in square octagon round. We're just going to draw this out. And this needs to be fairly thin so we can get it in the eye to start opening the eye. I think that's pretty good. You can kind of see what we've got there. Looks like a carrot. Now we're going to flatten these corners out, which is the equivalent to making it octagon. I'm just not going to really go to a true octagon. And that is most of the heavy forge work done. The next thing is I want to leave one side fairly sharp and round up the other side. To do that I'm going to go to a V-swedge, put the sharp side down, and work this with a hammer. I think I'll go to a little smaller hammer though. There's going to be some filing and grinding on this. Another way you can do this is to put a swedge over, a round swedge on top, and it works real well. But I don't think I have a swedge of the right size that'll fit in this little V-swedge. If I was making a lot of these, I'd make combination tools. Let's go to the other end. We want to keep the same side down on this. Remember, we're rounding this, so once you get a flat, go to rounding. You can see where this is going to take a fair amount of filing or grinding, but it's getting the shape we want. Try and blend all the little facets that you've created. The smoother you can make this now, the easier it's going to be to file later. And this is going to be hard to hold in a vise to hot rasp. I'm going to turn that around again and work from the other end some more. I really think this is about the limit of what I'm going to try and do with forging. The better you can do at the anvil, the happier you're going to be when it comes time to file. But at some point you just have to hot rasp, file, grind, whatever it is you're going to do. So now that's ready to go into the vermiculite. I let our little punch and our drift sit in the vermiculite overnight. So these are now ready to shape. You could certainly hot rasp these while they're hot, and the punch would lock in the vise very nicely. But I wasn't sure how I was going to hold this drift, and I still haven't completely figured it out. It's going to want to slip around in the vise, and it seemed problematic hot. Plus the vise probably would have left some marks in it that I would still have to file out cold. So we're going to do a little bit of a combination of different things here. We'll start off showing you how you can file this, see how easy it is to file, but I'll probably finish it up with a grinder just to get it done and have a tool we can get back to work with. The first thing I'm going to do is just file the top surface of this. It's fish-lipped a little bit, it's cupped over, and that has to go because that's going to cause a problem in the long run when we use it. We didn't film that whole process. That's probably about 10 or 15 minutes worth of filing. But I've got this flat on top, and I've beveled around the edges so that I can strike that easier. And then I've done the same thing down here at the bottom so it goes into the punched hole nicely. Now we need to clean up all these hammer facets on here. It's generally the right shape, but it isn't smooth. And this is going to be considerably more difficult with a file, but we'll see what we can do. See if I can get it to stand up, and doesn't want to stand up very well, does it? That's really going quite nicely. You want this to be symmetrical when you're done. The round stuff just doesn't like to hold in the vise very well. But it's holding well enough. It's going better than I thought it might. So that's what that would be like to file. Now what would it be like to use the angle grinder on that? This still presents the same problem we were having, that somehow I need to get to all these surfaces. So I think I'm going to try and hold it right up there, and I'll show you how I'm going to do that. So I'm going to clamp this in a pair of vice grips, and then clamp the vice grips in the vise. It leaves a little hollow to keep it from sliding this way. The vice grips should keep it from going any other direction. And that'll let us get about 1/4 of it up in here. We'll have to flip it around, flip it end for end. Just generally work on it. Remember your respiratory protection and your hearing protection when you're using an angle grinder. You may still have to do some of this with it upright in the vise. So that's what that might look like to use the angle grinder. Very effective, does a very nice job. My favorite is still the belt grinder because it's real good at getting these smooth curves on here. So I'm going to go ahead and finish this up on the belt grinder. But if you don't have a belt grinder, it's certainly possible to hot rasp, file, or use an angle grinder on this, or a little handheld belt sander even. So I'm going to use my slower belt grinder. I'm going to do a little work with the contact wheel and a little work up here on the belt where it's slack, because that really helps get these curves nicely right there. This is something that if you're not comfortable with, don't do it. But I'm comfortable to hand hold this. Yes, if you get your fingers close, you can abrade your finger. And on a really coarse belt, you can take a fair amount of meat off. But it's always just kind of a road rash sort of a thing, and not a major injury. You got to be careful though, and practice with something bigger. Trying to hold this in a clamp, I think, would be a real problem with this machine. I think it would grab it and throw it way easier than trying to hand hold it. So I did a little bit of work with a 60 grit belt and then a 240 grit belt, and I think that is just fine for use, just like it is. Now it's time to go on and work on our punch. This is going to be a little bit easier. It is a more uniform shape and easier to forge, so it's much closer to its finished dimension. Just a little cleanup on the top, a little cleanup and shaping this, and then this will need to be hardened and tempered. I think I'm just going to use the drift as is. This is coil spring, something very comparable to a 5160 in most cases. Automotive coil spring, I should say. Comparable to 5160, and it's pretty tough stuff, and I think for a drift this small and as rarely as this will get used, I'm perfectly comfortable not bothering to harden and temper the drift. It's pretty tough stuff. But the punch, I think, will last longer and behave better if we harden and temper it. But let's go ahead and clean it up first. We want it flat across the top with the edges relieved so it doesn't chip. Now you can see in the middle, this is shining up and getting nice and clean on the edges, but not right down the center stripe. That's because it mushrooms over a little bit or upsets the edges as I was rounding this. So we need to get this so it's flat and smooth, and that doesn't create a place that might prevent pulling the punch back out. We want this a little sharp point right in the very center. Hopefully we can see that. Just kind of a little pyramid shape. It may not show up real well. But it's ready now to harden and temper. Heat treat process on this is no different than everything else we've ever heat treated. It's just a matter of bringing it up to the proper temperature and quenching it in the proper medium. In this case, the proper temperature is about 1500 degrees, and we're going to guess that by eye today. And the quench medium is oil, and that's based on tests I've done on this same section of coil spring. You get a section of coil spring, you do the test once, you know the whole spring is going to heat treat the same way, so I don't have to do it over and over again. So I already know how this is going to behave. Next time I get a coil spring, I'll have to do something different. Now we're doing this in the coal forge. If you've been listening to me talk about heat treat, I probably give the impression that I think an electronic oven is the only way to go. And I certainly believe it's the best way to go. But blacksmiths have been heat treating in a coal fire or some other forge atmosphere for thousands of years, as propane forges have become more common. Most blacksmiths probably heat treat a propane forge or a coal forge. I understand that probably less than 1% of the people watching these videos have access to an electronic heat treat oven. So I don't really expect that that's the standard that everybody's going to use. We can do a very good job in the forge. It's just not as precise and repeatable and reliable as the electronic oven is. But if you pay attention and you practice and you take notes on what happened and what was good and what was bad, does this tool behave better than the last tool, what'd you do different, then you can do a really good job in this. One of the key elements really is making sure you have an even heat. Now for this, we don't need to harden the struck end. If we do, I'm going to soften it again. I'll take a torch and heat it up and draw the temper way back on that. But we need an even heat on the end that's doing the work. If you just get the surface hot, you can harden the surface, but it's going to have a soft core, and that could create stresses that will cause a crack. So you want an even heat throughout when you go to quench. And part of the way you do that is by soaking. So I'm just going to put this on top of the coal fire, and I'm going to ignore it for a while. I'll turn the blower on every now and then just to bring that up to temperature, but I don't actually want it to glow. At this point, I just want to get it good and hot and bring that temperature up slowly. Then I'll slowly bring it up to what I believe will be critical temperature. So this has been in here soaking for about 15 minutes now. I think there's just ever so, if I put it in the chimney in the shadows, ever so slightly a red color. Still magnetic, and we know that it has to be above magnetic. And 5160 is probably a little more than 100 degrees. So we need to continue to get it a little bit hotter. I'll bring it up nice and slow. And I want to bring this whole area here up to temperature, not just the tip. So I want to push it through the fire and get the thick spot at the hot part of the fire, not the very tip of the tool. Turn it over every now and then, make sure it's heating as evenly as I can heat it. That's lost magnetism, so we need to be about 100 degrees hotter than that. And that's that we just have to kind of judge by eye, intuition, and experience. I think I'm probably there, so let's go to the oil. And we're going to quench the whole tool. We're going to keep it moving in the oil. And this is a commercial grade oil meant for hardening and tempering. At some point I'll probably go to an olive oil. Perhaps not as good, but it won't stink as bad and probably isn't quite as unhealthy as this is. All smoke's bad for you, though. So you want to do that until it's cool enough that you can touch it. Okay, so that's the end of the hardening process. Now we'll need to temper it. First, though, I'm going to hit this with a file. That is definitely hard. And then I'm going to polish this up just a little bit. I'm going to use a brick. This is a little bit of a traditional method of doing this. Not really the way I'd always do it, and I'll explain that in a minute. So I'm also going to temper this by eye. And we could have left some heat up in the shank and let it bleed down. But trying to get everything coordinated while you're doing a video sometimes gets difficult. So I'm just going to polish it up with this little bit of a brick here, so I can see the colors change. And that's really all I need to do. Now I'm going to put the struck end in the fire. I'm going to put that as straight up and down as I can get it, and I'm not going to turn the blower on. I just want to watch and see the color changes come up. I don't know if you'll be able to see that very well or not. Well, hopefully you can see a little bit of this. For a tool like this, I'm going to go purple to blue. It's going to be over-tempered in use anyways. So mostly what I'm really doing is just hardening and making this a harder tool, even though it's never really going to have edge holding ability due to the heat of working it. Or working with it, I should say. Interestingly, since I've moved that, I can actually see this better on the camera than I can in person. So I'm going to watch the film right along with you, and we're going to see how long this takes. Now, a very traditional way of hardening and tempering a tool like this is to just quench the end of the tool where it needs to be hard. Quench it up and down a little bit so you don't have a sharp line where it goes from quenched to unquenched. Polish it up real quick and then let the heat from the tool bleed back down. And we've looked at that in previous tools, and we'll do that again for some other things. I just chose to do this one this way so I could stop and move the camera and do things like that when I otherwise would have to be watching for changes in temper colors. Now, a lot of people don't bother to harden tools like this because they figure they're just going to get tempered too soft in use anyways. And while they do temper some, they will never be fully annealed again unless you heat it up to critical temperature and anneal it. So even though you're going to draw more temper incrementally as you use the tool, it's still going to be harder than if you did not harden it in the first place. So I think it's worth going through this step for the punch. For the drift, I don't think it matters. Now I'm starting to see some changes here. Right down in here, I'm starting to see a little bit of a bronze color coming on. And that's one of the first tempering colors that comes up. Behind that will be what is referred to as a peacock color. I guess straw is really the first temperature. It's a real light yellow. Then it moves on to bronze, and then peacock, then purple, and then the blues. And after blue, it turns kind of a steel gray color. Now you can see that this is getting into the peacock range down low here, right through there, and turning kind of a light blue. It's kind of a straw color up towards the tip. And that's one problem with doing it this way, is it's not an even temper throughout. Whereas doing it in an oven, you get an even temper throughout. So it's gone through kind of the bronze. This is really what we call peacock now, right up in here. The light blue is hotter than a dark blue, so you really get a good idea of the full range of tempering colors here. It's turning out to be a very good look at that. And that's where I'm going to quench it. Well, here's our punch. You can see better the kind of pyramid shape, vaguely center punchish tip it has on there. And we'll explain more about that and why I did it that way when we do our little railroad spike hawk. And here is the drift, both of these made by half by 3-inch bar that was drawn out of a automotive coil spring or a truck coil spring, something similar to 5160, and that's what the railroad spike was made out of as well. This is hardened and tempered. This was left as is just because it'll take a fair amount of abuse, it'll get real hot, and it doesn't need a cutting edge, it's just a shaping tool. So I'm going to pound fairly hard on that, and I don't really need it to be hard for a cutting edge, so I think it'll survive just fine. If not, we can harden it, we can temper it fully to a fairly high temperature, and it'll work just fine either way. So Smitty says that's it for this video. It's time to pet the cat instead of do videos. We have a punch, we have a drift made out of, you guessed it, half by 3-inch material, and that's just another way to interpret that blacksmith challenge. The next part of that challenge we'll do will be the Tomahawk out of the railroad spike that I made. So it's kind of an involved process, and I'm just doing this because I feel like it. All of these things are probably done more simply if you aren't trying to do it out of that specific bar size. And for those of you in Europe or someplace else using the metric system, that's roughly 13 millimeter by 7.5 centimeters long, or 75 millimeters long. So for that conversion. People have asked, so there it is. Don't get used to it. I probably won't look up all the conversions every time, but I'll try to do it a little bit more often. Now, we went through an entire hardening and tempering process, pretty well explained it all over again, and I've done this quite often on this channel. So I'm going to ask the question, do you want me to explain that whole process every time, or do we just want to say we hardened and tempered it because we've already explained how to harden and temper it? I kind of get the impression there's always somebody new on the channel that hasn't seen the old videos on hardening and tempering and appreciates watching that entire process and seeing it explained a little bit differently, so you know that it isn't always done exactly the same way. There are ways around the heat treat oven. You can do it in the coal forge, you can do it in the propane fire, you can do it with a torch. The oil is different than water, is different than air, is different from brine, and if we do it every time, we get to see all those differences, but it also might get tedious for those of you who already understand it. So give me an opinion down there if you want to about whether or not you think we ought to harden and temper, do the full process and discuss it every time or not. In the meantime, I hope you like this video and give it a thumbs up. Love it if you hit that subscribe button. I hope you have time in your day to get out to the shop, make something, do something for the Blacksmith Challenge, or do something completely different. It doesn't matter. Just spend time in the shop being creative. But do stay safe, do wear safety glasses, and we'll see you for the next one.